about modernizing IT infrastructure. And so with that, I'll pass it off to you.
All righty, perfect. Can you guys see the screen I'm sharing?
No, I don't believe I can see it.
All right, let me see here. Let me know if you can see that.
Yep, yeah, we can see it now.
All righty, perfect. Well, thank you, Michael, for the introduction. And just want to say thank you to everybody who's putting on this conference today. I think this is fantastic. But with that being said, we'll start to get into it. So with a little bit of background about me here, I'm a recent graduate from Michigan Technological University up in the upper peninsula of Michigan there. I graduated with a degree in computer science. I'm currently leading IT security for a company called Airboss of America. We focus primarily in manufacturing throughout North America and have a lot of work with the DoD and other NATO allies. So really, really cool and interesting leading IT security there for that organization. My background, I think, is kind of a nice perspective on this. Being recently out of university, having more of a leadership role in IT security at a good mid-sized organization. I think there's a lot of unique challenges that have been really interesting to tackle and to deal with. You learn a lot of things in school about the way security should be done, how a lot of companies handle their security. And it's interesting when you get out into the real world and you kind of see the little nuances that make security difficult and that make a lot of this stuff a challenge. I take a very hands-on approach with security. We're a relatively small team. So it's really nice to kind of have that perspective and that background with it. So that being said, I want to kind of talk about some of the current challenges that exist with when it comes to IT security at most mid-sized organizations, right? Companies that aren't large enough to have, security teams of dozens or hundreds of people involved, right? You learn a lot about this kind of stuff, and a lot of the current mentality you see around security is a lot of people saying things like, take all your assets, put them behind your corporate firewall, defend your corporate LAN at all costs, right? Like that's kind of the traditional model that security has followed is really, take all your assets, make sure you keep them in one place, and then defend those assets at all costs, right? Use network segmentation to break up your networks. You want to make sure that you're filtering things that are coming in, monitor what's going out, and then, to kind of manage what exists in your network and to make sure that you're securing those devices properly. You see a lot of organizations using things like traditional network scanners, asset scanners like SolarWinds, and then things like just simple Excel spreadsheets, right? Not a lot of fancy tools out there. There's some really good stuff, but a lot of these mid-sized organizations don't have the skills or expertise on hand to really utilize some of those tools. And this, a lot of the challenges that you see arise from this, this is a good traditional way of thinking about it. But there's a lot of disadvantages to using this kind of a model. So a lot of the problems that kind of arise from this kind of traditional model where you have your assets, you keep them in your corporate network, and then you kind of defend them from there. Not all devices are on corporate networks nowadays, right? This is something that has been kind of exacerbated with COVID and the work from home situation, right? How do you manage those corporate assets that never live on your network, right? Or that may only communicate with your network on a very rare, very infrequent basis, right? How do you handle users that work from home, tools that exist only within the cloud, assets that don't ever touch your corporate infrastructure, right? It can start to get really difficult to try to control, manage, monitor, and secure those assets when you don't have a lot of visibility to reach out and communicate with them. That being said as well, looking back at some of those other tools, things like network scanning, some of those traditional approaches for monitoring what assets that you have in your environment, devices come on and off the network frequently, right? How do you manage a laptop that maybe someone comes into the office 2 days a week, right? They're not there for very long. They only pop in shortly, right? If you're trying to scan your network to monitor for assets that exist, it's very likely that, you'll miss that host, or you won't have good knowledge of that host, right? It may be seen infrequently. You may not be able to do things like vulnerability scanning against it reliably. There's a lot of limitations there when you have hosts that are constantly coming on and off the network and aren't there on a frequent basis. From there also, how do you monitor, ensure that devices that are connecting are secure, right? Let's say you have a user who is, who hasn't been connected to your corporate network for a month. They've been working from home for the past month. And during that time, they haven't used the VPN. They haven't communicated with your corporate infrastructure whatsoever. And then they come back from their home where they've been using their computer. They bring it into the office. It connects to your network, right? How do you know that that device has received, the latest security policy updates that you've pushed out, or really ensure that device is getting its updates properly, that those are working the way they should be, or that the device hasn't been compromised while it was at that user's home, right? And then from there, it kind of gets into how do you secure these devices that exist within in your environment that are accessing corporate data that may not be untrusted networks, right? Continue with that kind of example of users who are working from home, users who are, not coming into the office on a regular basis. They still have that requirement to work, right? Users still have to be able to use corporate assets, use company computers. But they may be doing so on devices or on their home networks, right? And as a security administrator, as any IT administrator, you can't go through and monitor and secure your home users' networks, and you can't monitor every home user's network, right? You can defend that singular asset, that let's say laptop in this case, but to go through and make sure that their home router is up to date, or that it has been compromised, or that another laptop that may exist on their home network hasn't been compromised and is now attacking your computer, that can be difficult, right? Especially when you're trying to stick with that traditional model of all my assets exist on my local area network, and those are the ones I focus on, those are the ones I defend. It can really leave you open to a lot of blind spots. And that's something that I've encountered, right? When I first joined the organization a few years back, that was kind of something that we were looking at and saying, okay, how do we start to manage a lot of these devices that are kind of those edge cases, right? It's really easy to manage the bulk 80, 90% of your devices. They sit in the office, they never move, they never go anywhere, they're always there, right? What do you do for that small percentage yet critical number of assets that don't fit into that perfect little box, that perfect little model of they sit here, they get their updates, we can monitor them, our tools work against them, right? You really need to kind of evolve and start to look at some of the other options that are out there. Thankfully, there's a lot of good stuff out there. So a lot of these tools out there that exist are things, they require you to kind of expand on that traditional model, right? Centralization works really well. That idea of I want all my assets in one place, I'm going to defend that one place, and then go from there. That works really well, but it just has to be adapted when you start to get into this newer model that we're seeing, where there's more non-traditional assets, things like areas where data is stored that may be hosted by a third party, right? Or things like devices that are constantly moving around, right? Centralization works really well. It provides a common source of truth. It's relatively easy to manage, right? Because you can log into one area, or you can use one tool to monitor and see what's going on in your environment. The problem with centralization is it's relatively hard to achieve, right? It's hard to get everything to fit into one box, to fit into that one area, and have them communicate in that way. From there, that's where cloud gets really useful, right? So you hear a lot of people talking about, utilizing cloud resources, pushing up to the cloud, things like that, right? That's something that, we've seen a lot of success with, is something where, instead of, making sure that all of our users are, logging in a certain way, utilizing something like a access management provider like Okta or Duo or some other form of service, right? They can be really useful for saying any corporate service we have, whether it's, an ERP system, whether it's just logging in to access data like files, whether it's trying to log into a third-party solution like Salesforce or Concur for expense management, different things like that, right? It can be really useful to funnel all of those authentication requests through a single source, set it up with single sign-on so that you can manage that from there, right? If I just have 10 different applications that all my users are trying to log into for various different purposes, right? It can be hard to manage those 10 different services to say, we need to make sure people are using secure passwords, or that they're logging in a secure form, a secure manner, right? Where it gets a lot easier is when you can say, we'll funnel all authentication requests through a single point of failure, so to speak. And from there, we can set different security models, different security controls, right? So we can say, if we have users logging in from Russia, maybe we just want to outright block that, right? Or maybe we push them, do a multi-factor request in that case, right? Those are kind of the things that give you those tools to see what's going on in your environment. And from there, it's a centralized point of log as well, right? So if I have 10 different applications, again, that all my users are trying to log into, it's hard to log into every one of those systems, pull different logs, try and see who's logging into where, see if there's any cause for concern. Again, when it's managed through that one system, you have a centralized point of truth. You have that centralized point of logging that makes it extremely easy to see what's going on in your environment. From there too, right, is setting up your environments that you prevent access to any of those corporate resources, any of those corporate systems, unless they're flowing through that centralized point, right? You should be setting up your systems to make sure that they don't work unless they work the way you intend them to. That's something that I have found to be extremely useful. Is say you set up single sign-on solution for one of your application services, but users are still able to just bypass that if they log into the website just by visiting the website directly, as opposed to going to your single sign-on portal, right? It kind of defeats the purpose there. So we really want to make sure that you force people to do things in a way that's predictable to you, in a way that you understand and it's easy to monitor. From there as well, when you look at things kind of from a cloud perspective and what solutions are offered there, it allows you to focus on device security a little bit easier as well. Because if you're monitoring your host from the cloud, right, you don't care whether that host is on your corporate network, at a user's home office, on the other side of the world, right? It doesn't really matter from there, because you can communicate and talk to those hosts anywhere as long as they have an internet connection. And that's one of the critical things that we've seen to be really helpful to us. Is like traditionally, if we have an application installed on the user's endpoint, whether it be their computer, their phone, whatever it may be, say we need to update that application, through using something traditional like group policy or SCCM, right? We would have to go through, push out an update through, say, SCCM, and then it would have to communicate with the end user's machines. And if that user's at home, right, they're not going to receive that update because they're not connected to our corporate network, right? There's ways to kind of get around that by forcing hosts to, when they're online, to automatically proxy to your corporate network. But that starts to get messy. It starts to get difficult to manage, and it really increases the complexity of your environment, which never makes things easier to secure. A much better approach is when you say, okay, we have a cloud service that deploys software to our host, and I know that the minute that host comes back online, whenever it has internet connection, it will communicate with this centralized solution. It will go through, it will reach out, and it will have those updates once we push them out. So to kind of expand on that, to kind of dig into some of the technology that exists out there for things like this that I'd kind of mentioned, right? When you come to things like authentication control, there's things like dual login, there's things like Okta, there's things like one login. These things make it really easy to centralize the authentication into your different solutions. And from there, kind of make sure that users are logging in a secure manner, do things like multi-factor, other solutions like that as well. When it comes to mobile device management, right, when you want to manage those peripheral devices, things like phones, things like tablets, things that aren't traditionally managed with a lot of traditional tools, there's a lot of options out there, things like G Suite, things like Intune provided by Microsoft. Cisco has their own mobile device management solution. And these tools are really powerful. And if you look and see a lot of them, they start to utilize that cloud model of managing devices from anywhere, as opposed to managing them from your traditional infrastructure. One of the tools that I've worked a lot with personally is a lot of the tools provided by Azure these days. So things like Azure Active Directory to allow users to sign in just as they normally would from anywhere, and kind of have that control using Endpoint Manager and Intune to secure those devices, whether they be Windows hosts, Mac computers, Linux computers, iPhones, Android phones, right? It gives you that centralized point of control to manage those devices from anywhere, right? Things that group policy and SCCM really lack, right? Because you can't, it's difficult to manage things like Mac host or pretty much impossible to manage mobile devices with those traditional systems. That's where Endpoint Manager and Intune really really help out a lot, is they give you that ability to manage all of those traditional assets and devices from one centralized point, and to do it from anywhere, which has been really beneficial. Things like data loss prevention as well, right? Knowing where your data is housed, keeping your data in centralized repositories makes it a lot easier to control, a lot easier to understand what you have, and then from there secure it, right? To track things like, maybe this, if we have files that live in this location, they should never be shared with people outside of the organization, right? Or we have files in this location, they can be shared publicly with anybody outside the organization. And then, assign things like data classification to those assets, so that when it's shared, we can track it, we know who it's being shared with, and we can see, what's being done there. Then getting into things like access controls policies as well. That's another very useful tool provided in the Azure suite. Things like, we can sit there and say, okay, the user just got a new Windows computer. They boot that computer up, but before we allow that computer to log in and access corporate assets like SharePoint, like Outlook, like email, like OneDrive, things like that, we need to make sure that device is fully up to date first, right? And you can set access control policies to say, hey, every time that device tries to access an online resource, whether it be OneDrive, SharePoint, email, whatever it may be, do a check to see if it's up to date. And if it's not, maybe we require the user to remediate that before accessing corporate resources. Maybe we give them some lead time to see, just to get them to update their device. Or if it's critical, maybe we can say that, listen, we'll just deny all access until you go through and you update this device appropriately, right? And one of the really benefits that I've seen there personally from using those tools is stuff like, when we have users who go out and then say sign into their email online, or try to access corporate data in that manner, it makes it a lot easier to manage when they're accessing data from personal devices, right? So if you have a user who goes home at night, say they boot up their old Windows XP machine, they want to log in to access their corporate email online or look at corporate files online. Clearly, we don't want them doing that from a legacy host system, and you can just outright deny requests and things like that. So that's been a really beneficial tool that I've seen that makes things a lot easier to kind of manage those less than traditional situations. And from there, when you start to utilize a lot of these tools where you take kind of that cloud-centric approach to asset management, it allows you to have greater segmentation and zero trust, right? Network segmentation is a key tool in protecting corporate assets. You don't want hosts talking to each other who don't need to be talking to each other. And when you really start to push things up and have everything off premise, not contained within your traditional corporate environment, it allows greater segmentation to get a lot easier, right? Theoretically, you could get to a point where if all your assets are in the cloud, everyone's always logging in through an authentication manager online, or accessing corporate resources that are online. There's no need for hosts to ever talk to each other on a traditional corporate network, right? You could have DNS, all that kind of stuff in the cloud, and then just have hosts only be able to communicate out. And it really eliminates a lot of that traditional attack surface that you see for things like lateral movement, through things like worming vulnerabilities, because even hosts that exist on your corporate network may not have any need or knowledge to know of other hosts that exist on your corporate network. They can be really advantageous there. I should mention too, if anyone has questions or anything, anytime during this presentation, feel free to just throw them in the chat. So kind of closing remarks around this kind of model, right? And kind of modernizing some of the IT security infrastructure. Asset management, it can be extremely difficult, right? It can be extremely difficult to kind of monitor those edge case devices that aren't on your corporate networks, devices that may get used rarely or infrequently. And that can make it really difficult to secure those devices and to monitor those devices and make sure that they remain compliant in the way that you need them to, right? Pushing things up to more of a cloud-centric approach, allowing those devices to be managed from anywhere, really helps to modernize that infrastructure and change that traditional model of, we'll just defend our corporate network, we'll put all our assets in here and we'll defend it at all costs. And it allows you to push a lot of those resources up, have them be managed from anywhere, and really make it easier to gain that visibility that's needed nowadays. Centralization is also key, obviously, to securing these assets, right? it does you no good if you push a bunch of services and data up to the cloud, but it's managed in 20, 15, 50 different, application services. And now you have to go to all these different services and monitor them and manage them and, make sure that users are accessing them in a secure way and that they're following the security controls you need them to. So centralizing that access, centralizing that management, centralizing that common source of truth is extremely beneficial to track and to kind of see, engage, how are we doing on compliance? Are we making sure that we're managing hosts in a manner that's appropriate? If we see, an attack happen, if we suffer a breach of some kind, right? Can we go through and can we create a policy that corrects that? And then from there, go through and minimize that attack surface in the future, right? Creating one policy for one solution is much easier than going through and creating a policy for 15, 20 different solutions. And then from there, greater segmentation as well, right? Going through and creating greater segmentation, eliminating the need for those hosts within your traditional environments to talk to each other and to cross-pollinate really helps to reduce attack surface and really helps to minimize the threat of a single host being compromised, leading to the compromise of other hosts in your environment. And then I saw we had a question coming through.
Yeah, so it looks like we have a question. So when do you think we will reach the critical point of the situation? And on top of that, will we be switching towards this modern infrastructure as a society within the next 5 to 10 years? Or if not, when do you predict so?
So to answer kind of the second part of that question, right? Do we see this society switching to this form of infrastructure? I think so, right? I think that it has kind of already begun. I think that a lot of more mature organizations have already started to adopt this model, right? Where I think the lag happens and really where the disconnect happens is a lot of those mid-sized and smaller organizations that don't have large corporate security teams, that may not even have IT people on staff, right? A lot of those organizations still take that approach of put everything behind your firewall, defend it at all costs kind of thing, right? I think where the maturity needs to happen as a security industry is to make these tools easier to use, to make them more attainable to those customers. But I think in the future, this is the way we'll see things, right? And the way I kind of think about it from time to time is when you think back to kind of the early days of the internet, when it was first being founded, right? There was no concept of network address translation, of NAT, right? All hosts just existed on the open internet. And you could freely communicate with any host, right? Obviously that led to a lot of problems, and that kind of led us to where we are today of people said, hey, I don't trust, these other hosts out there. So I'm going to create a centralized point of me being able to defend. And then from there, I can protect my assets behind that, whether it be a firewall or a proxy or whatever it may be. But we've kind of seen as time's gone on, right? That model doesn't work very well, right? People will still sit there and try to defend their corporate land, but then, we've seen as time goes on, people found ways to bypass firewalls. People found ways to get into hosts through things like through phishing, through through malicious websites and things like that. And a lot of times we still see in a lot of organizations, even ones that are fairly mature. If a host gets breached, it's relatively easy once that initial point of security has been breached to kind of spread and to move laterally through environments. And you see this in pretty much every ransomware attack that takes place today. Is organizations are trying to secure devices, or trying to secure the devices from the internet, and eventually those devices get breached, and then an attack is able to spread internally on the network. Pushing more towards this cloud, this decentralized model, kind of goes back to the original ideas of how the internet was being created. Of hosts shouldn't have to have a central point that protects them. Hosts should be able to be secure on their own. And if you have your corporate assets dispersed and they're treated as just another host on the internet, it makes it a little bit easier. It's hard to defend the host. Then you have to make sure that you have rigorous security policies and controls. But from there, it makes lateral movement extremely difficult. It allows for that flexibility to manage those hosts from anywhere. So hope that answered that question.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. That was a great answer. And I just want to spotlight something before we move on. if you look in the chat and you're competing in the CTF, go ahead and grab that conference flag and I'll get you some points. And thank you for coming. And moving on to our next question. What are some of the privacy implications of bringing corporate devices into employees' homes for the employees? The question is more intended towards issues that arrive from the exposure, less than about what employees do on the device. So for instance, a corporate laptop might be able to see network traffic, not generated by the laptop, but by other devices on the network.
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question, and it stems a lot from, those problems that you have, right? Like, how do you manage someone who has to bring their laptop home with them for work every night, right? I mean, that's, what before I would say, 5 years ago, I think most organizations would consider that somewhat of an edge case. But nowadays it's common practice, right? And I think that it's going to be common practice going into the future. Even if you work for an organization where there's a relatively few number of users doing that, you still need to account for it, right? And more than likely, the users that are doing it are going to be your more critical ones. And there's a lot of privacy concerns there, right? I still owe a duty to the organization to make sure that those devices are protected, to make sure that corporate data stays secure, no matter where it may be. But there's also a level of privacy owed to the user, right? It's not the place of the company to monitor for security threats outside of their assets, right? So it can start to get kind of tricky and kind of blur the lines there of what is a corporate asset, what's a corporate environment, and what's personal, right? I think you see that in a lot of cases where a lot of people are known to use their work emails for personal activities and things like that, right? It blurs those lines of what's private, what's company, what's personal, right? And it's a tricky model that I don't think as an industry there's been a consensus on yet, right? One of the audits I was working on recently dealt with cyber essentials for the UK government. And one of the requirements they have is that if a user works from home, they're required to report into their corporation the version of router that they're using and whether they manage it personally or whether it's managed by their internet service provider, right? And that's kind of, I think, one of the first cases I've seen where, in this case, it's regulations within the United Kingdom that require companies to monitor their home users' router equipment, right? And I think it's going to kind of foreshadow that as time goes on and as more users work from home, there's going to be a greater need to kind of make sure that the environments they're working on are secure. But I think, to kind of preserve that user privacy and that privacy that they're owed, that's where you have to focus on securing more of the asset itself as opposed to the environment around it, right? You can never, really, you should never trust the area or the environment that your hosts live in, whether it's your corporate LAN, whether it's the coffee shop down the street, whether it's their home network, right? The device should be resilient to all forms of attack, no matter where they come from. And that's where I think, you hear people talk about zero trust and things like that. That's kind of the embodiment of those ideas, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so shifting gears a little bit, how do you segment if the company does not know what IT devices are on their network? And how do you advise these companies to proceed with this?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, right? It's hard to segment when you don't know what's out there. And that's where a lot of companies, they try to manage their assets. But a lot of times, and what I've seen is usually they have, for devices, they know they have, printer areas, servers, workstations, wireless access points, things like that, right? But then there's kind of a mystery bucket where there's kind of a default, whether it be VLAN that they're attached to or a default network. It kind of depends how different organizations do it, but typically they'll throw them into kind of a default bucket where, if you have wireless access points and a device comes online, connects to the guest network, it may just route straight out to the internet, not touch your corporate environment. The tricky thing there too, though, is like, even when you do have asset management, even when you know what's out there, right? Let's say you have a VLAN for just the laptops in your organization, right? You may add all those hosts to that specific VLAN, but then tracking to make sure those hosts are still out there can be difficult, right? If Sally drops her computer, it shatters, it breaks, she's issued a new computer, and then, but no one ever communicates that original asset no longer exists. That's where it can get kind of difficult to say, okay, we still have this endpoint out here, it hasn't checked in a long time. Do we know if it exists? Do we know if it doesn't? And that's where you can see different organizations trying to scan their networks to see what's out there, especially when they have extremely large networks. And that can be difficult to kind of monitor and see, okay, we think this host is gone. It's been 3 months of scanning. We've never seen it come back. But then in month 4, it does, right? Because, someone finally, someone was out maybe on medical leave. Their host is offline for 3 months. They come back in month 4, their host is back. It can be difficult to manage assets in that manner. So, knowing what devices are out there makes it easy to put them on to different VLANs. But then also from there, going through and monitoring the devices that, you may know the class of the device or the VLAN it's assigned to, but then knowing to go out and see if those hosts still exist can be difficult.
Gotcha. Thank you. That was an interesting take. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up. I think we all appreciate your talk. And again, if you haven't noticed in the chat, there's a flag there for those competing in the CTF. And do you have any final comments or thoughts to leave us with, Jack?
No, I don't think so. I think, like I said, I want to thank you guys for putting this on. Michael, you've been fantastic. And thank you to everyone else who worked on the CTF and everything it takes to put conferences like this together. I think it was really great to see. And I hope there's more like this in the future.